Welcome back to the virtual speaker series. My name is Adian and I use pronouns he, his, and him. And today we have another very special Movember episode. This does mean we are talking about Black men's health, as that is the topic for Movember at Cal Poly. That being said, in this episode, Brandon Roul will be walking us through a contextual history of Black mistrust of the medical industry in the United States. After that, Brandon will be sharing some of his own experiences as a Black man in a racist atmosphere. But before we jump right into that, a few words about Brandon. He is an aspiring civil rights attorney and a recent Cal Poly graduate. While he's at Cal Poly, he studied political science with a concentration in pre-law and also took on 3 minors. Those are ethnic studies, French, and anthropology geography. On top of that, he was also a student assistant for the Men Masculines program and last year's co-host of the speaker series. So I'm incredibly excited to welcome him back to the show today.
Welcome back, Brandon. We're glad to have you here again. And we just want to say thank you for putting your time, your energy, and your thought into this project and being part of one last Movember here at Cal Poly.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Adian. Like Adian said, my name is Brandon Roul, pronounced he and his, and I'm a recent Cal Poly grad. And today I'm speaking on Black men's health for Movember's edition of Virtual Speaker Series. So first and foremost, one of my strengths for our signature themes back in my time at Cal Poly was context. So I think that's only fitting that I provide some historical context to the issues affecting the health of men in the Black community. So, and I know that the topic of discussion today is Black men's health specifically, but I think it's crucial to never ignore the very real presence of Black women in our history because they have been with us Black men through thick and thin and rarely receive any credit nor recognition. So the first date I have on this nifty timeline right here is the year 1845, and that happens to be the year this monster known as James Marion Sims began experimenting on enslaved Black girls. And for emphasis' sake, these were teenage girls, not women. And for contextual history of the medical distrust that the Black community now has today, it's important to go back into the past and analyze this history. And so James Marion Sims is known as the father of gynecology, and he got there by repeatedly operating without anesthesia on Black enslaved girls. And the first of which was Lucy, who is an 18-year-old girl. He also performed 30 operations on a 17-year-old girl named Anarcha. And then Betsy was a young 17 or 18 years old girl. He experimented on several other Black girls through painful operations without anesthesia, whose names have not been recorded in history books, as is the case with a lot of Black history in the United States of America. So just right off the bat, there's some very clear medical exploitation of Black bodies, which has continued to this day. Next on the timeline is the year 1951, which is when Henrietta Lacks visits the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And if you're familiar with the immortal cell line, using scientific research known as HeLa cells, they come directly from this Black woman named Henrietta Lacks. So back to what I was saying, back in 1951, Henrietta Lacks visits the Johns Hopkins Hospital to diagnose some abnormal pain and bleeding in her abdomen. And the doctors there quickly diagnosed her with cervical cancer. And unbeknownst to her, during subsequent radium treatment, which was the best treatment at the time, they take some samples of her tumor without her knowledge and consent and send it to this Dr. Gray. Now, this Dr. Gray had been collecting cells from all patients who came through the doors of the Johns Hopkins Hospital at the time with cervical cancer. But unlike all other samples collected, Lax's cells doubled every 20 to 24 hours. And she died of the cancer months later, but her cells were shared widely and still to this day are used and become the backbone of a lot of advances in medical research. And today, work done with her cells underpins much of modern medicine. They've been involved in key discoveries in many fields, including cancer, immunology, and infectious diseases. And one of their most recent applications has been in research for vaccines against this current pandemic of COVID-19. And her legacy is that today, her family has yet to see any of the profits that her cells have given to the medical industry. And I think it's important to touch on the fact that the Johns Hopkins Hospital, where her cells were collected, was racially segregated and was one of only a few that provided medical health care to Black people at the time. And perhaps the most enduring wound in the United States of America health science, especially as it pertains to Black men specifically, is the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. And it began in 1932, pause for a second right there, and ended in 1972. So that's a whole 40-year time period. And it was known officially as the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. And the 40-year experiment was run by public health service officials following 600 rural Black men in Alabama with syphilis over the course of their lives. And it was originally intended to last 6 months, but as I said, it would last 40 years. So that's an extension if I've ever heard one. And long story short, the public health service officials refused to tell their patients their diagnosis, refused to treat them for the debilitating disease, and actively denied them treatment once penicillin was discovered as an effective treatment. So they basically led a study to purposely kill these Black men and see how the disease ravaged their bodies through later autopsies. And whistleblowers brought an end to the incredibly unethical study in 1972, finally prompting the development of what would become modern medical ethics. But the lives of those Black men and their families were forever ruined. Many of them died from their complications of syphilis, and several of their wives and children also later contracted the disease. The Tuskegee syphilis study, however, was not a singular event that was reported and processed immediately, but a generational scarring that has defined a decade of Black history and continues to affect the health of Black people to this day. And as we've seen, the history of medical and research abuse of Black people goes well beyond Tuskegee, but the Tuskegee study is widely recognized as a reason for mistrust of the healthcare industry by the Black community. Because of more than 4 centuries of biomedical exploitation, Black patients consistently express less trust in their physicians and the medical system than white patients, are more likely to believe medical conspiracies, and are much less likely to have common positive experiences in healthcare settings. These beliefs are reinforced through differential treatment in comparison to their white counterparts, white patients, and through a lack of cultural diversity and competence among these physicians. Black patients frequently receive less information, empathy, and attention from their physicians regarding their medical care than their white counterparts. And countless studies have shown that Black patients are less likely to receive medical services than white patients with similar complaints and symptoms. Now to quotes, now to go to a quote by physician and the LinkedIn connection that I have, Dr. Che Black says, when I think about healthcare and medicine, especially when we're talking about racial health inequalities, like the Black maternal mortality crisis, I think about life or death. And that's very true. For those who weren't always aware of the reality of the matter, I think 2020 has highlighted the very real racial disparities in healthcare. Racism is deeply embedded within the institution, and not having a nuanced understanding of it only leads to the perpetuation of racial health inequalities. So in analyzing today's health climate as it relates to Black men and Black people more broadly, I think it's important to hammer in the point and acknowledge that the risk factor is racism, not race. People aren't dying at higher rates because of the fact that they are Black. We are dying because of the treatment we receive from the rest of society because we are Black. And this racism manifests itself in a variety of ways, overtly and covertly. So in more obvious ways and in more subtle ways. So first and foremost, I think most people can agree that when we think of the medical industry, the image of a doctor comes up in our minds. And the thing is, when you live in a racist society, you begin internalizing all of the messaging that surrounds you in this world in a process known as socialization. And doctors are no different. Doctors are human beings just like the rest of us. And it gets to the point where they may be treating patients differently based on misconceptions that they have related to pain tolerance, pain medication seeking, presentation of symptoms, and a whole bunch of other things, and may not even realize it because symptoms don't always appear the same way that they do and people with different shades of skin. It's just harder to see certain things, like even bruising. So that goes a long way. Next up is policy. Policy is one of the biggest reasons the social construction of race has been inextricably linked to socioeconomic status. Black people have particular experiences regarding health due to social detriments like a lack of access to healthcare, education, and generational wealth. And this is caused by racial injustice in the form of policies like redlining. It's not because of race, but because of policies that have been put into place, like not being able to buy property, not being able to rent, different policies like that that affect generations to come. Generational wealth is a big thing, and if there's policies set in place where you aren't able to own property, it's harder to acquire wealth. And all in all, the realities of the current health climate for Black Americans can be traced back to disinvestment, which has created situations where marginalized communities are made more vulnerable when it comes to catching the virus, dying from the virus, and dying at the hands of the state. Though the entire world is dealing with heightened levels of anxiety, increased stress, loneliness, depression, and grief, Black folks have the added advantage of being the community most impacted by COVID-19 deaths. We're more likely to live in viral hotspots, more likely to lose our jobs and experience pay cuts and wage losses due to being essential health workers. And our communities are being policed far differently for social distancing infractions than more affluent white communities. Recent data for parts of Ohio, for example, analyzed by ProPublica, showed that Black people were at least 4 times as likely to be charged with violating stay-at-home orders than white people. And that's not even touching upon the sadness, hopelessness, and disgust, blinding rage that comes with seeing the constant images of Black death that have been flooding all of our social media feeds in 2020. Which brings us to the current topic of the racial climate. Not to be a dead horse, but over the last several months, the COVID-19 pandemic and the brutal murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Dejon Kizzee, Daniel Pruitt, Deon Kay, Jonathan Price, Marcellus and Walter Wallace, among many, many other names, have revealed the deep racial inequities embedded throughout our society. These recent shootings of Black men, either by police or others, don't just result in the physical destruction of our Black bodies, but also take a mental, emotional, and physical toll on us, which affects health in a variety of ways. And it's because discrimination, like other stressors, can affect through both actual exposure and the threat of exposure. Research indicates that it's not just the big experiences of discrimination, like being passed over for a job or not getting a promotion that someone felt they might have been entitled to, but the day-to-day little indignities that affect health, like being treated with less courtesy than others, being treated with less respect, and receiving worse service at restaurants and different places like that, or stores than white counterparts. And research finds that persons who score higher on those kinds of experiences, if you follow them over time, you see more rapid development of things like coronary heart disease. So it travels from the mental, emotional, and psychological to the physical. And it's not always just about the physical, although 2020 has shown us that racism can often lead to the very visceral physical death of others. And when it comes to ways in which things can be avoided, such as police brutality, people often come up with 2 things. Black men need to either become more educated, acquire more wealth, or both at the same time. And thing is, those things don't save Black men. In a recent study done by Associate Professor of Family Medicine at Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, Los Angeles, Shervin Asari found that education protects Black men less than it protects other groups from depressive symptoms and psychological distress. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it means that success is not enough to reduce this depression and distress. Black men who have high aspirations and motivation to get to the top of society still feel unhealthy and still die early. So it's not a motivation thing. Like if people just stop being lazy, they could be better off in society. As long as the United States of America continues to discriminate against Black men, we will continue to show systemically poor outcomes in the health department, regardless of societal status. And then when it comes to wealth, money doesn't improve health for Black men across the board. Several studies have documented the high risk of depression in Black men and boys of high socioeconomic status. And one possible explanation for this is that Such individuals pay a high price for their ticket, so to speak, to the top of society. This journey opens eyes to the real inequities that exist in our society as you're traveling through and you're seeing how much harder it is to reach the vaulted top. And then in another study conducted by the same man, Srivanasari, he found that white men on average gained most life expectancy from their employment, but black men, however, died early regardless of their employment. Thus, once again, in today's United States of America, racism is a root cause of poor health for black men. Now, as a black man myself, I just want to touch upon my own experience because it's not just a theoretical thing that I'm talking about, but a very real lived experience for myself. And quite simply, the rules are different in the game that we call life for people like me. And this extends to wearing a hood, like in the picture of me to the left. As a kid, I used to never wear the hood of my hoodie, rain or shine, because of the negative and honestly life-threatening connotations associated with being a black man wearing a hoodie. And this was before Trayvon Martin in 2012. It's just something that I think a lot of other black boys know. We know how we're viewed if we have a hood, even if it's not a sketchy situation or anything. We know how other people see us. And it's a shame that people actually have to think this way. But I never wanted to place myself in a situation where I'm mistaken for someone who fits the description, which was a big reason why I never wore hoods, why I never let my little brother wear hoods. I'm different now, but my perspective has also changed. But meanwhile, I have a whole system down when it comes to driving because I never know whenever I'll be pulled over. I always make sure my pockets are empty at all times before I even step into the car and put my phone and wallet aside so that if I am pulled over, I don't need to reach on my person and I'm not mistaken for having something like a gun. Just things like that are conscious decisions I have to make to try and prolong my life because of the racist society that surrounds me, you, and everyone else in society. And I'm sure it's weird to see the word waiting on this slide, but it's true. Waiting is different when you're a black person. Um, I grew up I attended schools, including Cal Poly, that have always been predominantly white institutions. So whenever I'd meet with friends to work on a school project or to hang out, something like that, I'd make sure I never arrived before them and that I let them know I was there before I even arrived at the door. And the reason for this is because like I said, I went to a high school in a predominantly white and affluent area. And although I lived in the same town during my high school career, I would always get looks of you don't belong here. As soon as I entered those neighborhoods and I was just with friends, it's like, oh, are they lost? It's like, no, I'm actually here waiting for a friend. So the rules are different. You don't want to be out there waiting in front of the door for like 30 minutes for your slow friend who's like, oh, I'm taking a shower real quick. No, then I'd wait inside my car. I'm not gonna wait in front of the door and people are giving me strange looks like, oh, is he casing the house or something like that. And the last thing I have on my slide, but certainly nowhere near the last I've experienced differently, is shopping. And I think it's common knowledge nowadays that Black people are often followed through stores because of false suspicions of shoplifting. But I don't think many people have to put extra considerations into just simple things like not bringing already bought food into grocery stores, because that gives the impression of store clerks, other people there, it's like, oh, they're not paying for the food here in the grocery store, they're just eating. It's like, no, actually, this very clearly says McDonald's. I did not get this from the grocery store. I'm just eating food while shopping. But quite simply, the rules are different. And all these things combined have an effect on the health and psyche on the mind of Black men like myself. While others have the privilege of not needing to do so, there's always those extra considerations that must go into place for us if we want to prolong our survival, like I said. And it's terrible, but it's the harsh reality. And the fact of the matter is that the pros in 2020 have done a good job weeding out who is really there for you and who is not, at least as it relates to me, I think, which is why I think it's important to differentiate between people who are commonly known as allies and accomplices. Squares and rectangles, but just like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. All accomplices are allies, but not all allies are accomplices. And this is because while an ally is willing to stand in support of those marginalized. Accomplices are risk takers and are willing to use their power and privilege to challenge the status quo and achieve racial equity. Accomplices hold the struggle for racial justice as more important than their potential discomfort or white privilege. I mean, it's a privilege, after all, to lose interest in advocating for Black lives. It's a privilege I don't have because it's my life. Black Lives Matter is a movement. It's not just a moment in history. And I've always known the truth that my life matters, but it's obvious that today there are people um, who deny the value of Black lives. And some people really need to ask themselves why they are more concerned about things like looting than they are about Black lives. But to move on, what can be done to help alleviate these problems, two things come to mind. The first thing is education, educating yourself, communication. When it comes to education, it's never too late to diversify your bookshelf and unlearn these behaviors that we've been socialized to think are inherent truths. Meanwhile, it's long past the time to have those uncomfortable conversations with those around you, with those close to you. The lives of Black men, Black people, and everyone in general depends on the world needing more accomplices in the fight against racism. And yeah, that's all I have. Thank you for having me. Black Lives Matter.
Excellent.
I do really appreciate you sharing not only the information about the medical industry and how that's affected Black lives, but also your own experiences. I know it's very personal, and I just want to say thank you for that.
But while you were talking, some ideas did come to my mind. And I'd love to.
I'm glad.
I'm well, of course. I mean, that's what we're hoping for with these presentations. But I would love to circle back on some topics you brought up, if that's all right with you.
It's perfectly fine. I expected this.
Excellent. So I know you were talking primarily about the medical industry and how that's affected Black individuals in the US, but you also touched on a lot of different subjects, whether it's socially, economically, or politically. And so I think it's undeniable that racism is essentially embedded into US history. So, that's a huge problem. How do you tackle something like that? But particularly, how can you disrupt all these different areas that are kind of propagating racism? I mean, do you feel that these systems in place are propagating them in the first place? And, how can we as individuals, as groups, as communities come together to disrupt them if they are?
So first, you just basically asked me how to solve racism, and I do not have the answer by myself. But yeah, to answer the first question, these systems are definitely perpetuating racism. Like you said, racism is embedded within these very structures, whether people realize it or not. Like even terminology in things like computer science. Um, I'm blanking because it's early in the morning, but there's terminology like master and slave, just things like that already show how racism has been with us, is still with us, and continues to this day. And ways in which we can disrupt um, systematic racism is to unlearn behavior and to really analyze why we think certain ways, to think critically about that. When we receive information, to not accept it at face value, but to be like, okay, where's this information coming from exactly? Who wrote it? When did they write it? Why did they write it? What do they gain by writing things like this? And when you ask yourself questions like this, things do become apparent. It's like, oh yeah, this is being said because it helps with the goal of passing this policy to getting more wealth for this group of people. And it's really about asking questions. And like I said, educating yourself, not relying on the people being affected the most by racism to educate you, but to take it upon yourself to learn. It's never a bad thing to ask questions, but the labor, especially unpaid labor, should not continue to be on the backs of Black bodies and brown bodies. So yeah, unlearning behavior, thinking critically, and having those conversations are hard to have, but racial harmony will not be achieved through a colorblind ideology saying things like, I don't see color, I don't see race. In theory, that sounds like a nice thing, but you are denying reality. Like, reality is real, it matters. Saying, oh, I didn't even like think of you as a Black person. It may sound nice, like, I think of you as just a regular person, but being Black is a very big part of who I am. And when I walk through this world, I'm treated as a Black person. So you can say you don't see color, but everyone sees color. Even blind people can see color because of all the interactions we go through.
So, yeah, responding to that, definitely what you were saying there at the end about individuals who say, I don't see color. And yeah, that is in a lot of ways, almost just as bad as discrimination or racism, because you're denying a person's entire culture, their history, their experiences, and you're not really appreciating them as an individual. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Not only that, but ignoring the problem of racism does nothing to solve it. Like, if you ignore a leak, it does nothing to fix a broken pipe. You really need to analyze these deep-rooted issues if you want to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that last question was kind of broad. It was very, general, but you did come and discuss the medical industry in particular, and you did a great job exposing a lot of the inequalities and a lot of the reasons that mistrust arises in the medical industry for Black people in America. You know, when you are cut off from the access because of that mistrust, that's a huge problem. As you mentioned, it increases risks of certain diseases that are associated with being in a racist climate. So it's very important that Black individuals who are experiencing health complications because of the continued racism they experience can get access to that health. So I think moving forward, what do you think is the best way that the medical industry can regain the trust of Black individuals, either through, maybe policy or maybe trainings, or what do you think the direction is they need to move in?
I think it's deconstructing a lot of the institution itself, because like I said, it's been built off, just like a lot of things in this nation and many other nations, off the bodies of Black people and other people of marginalized communities. So even when it comes to recognition, giving recognition to the people who are responsible for those medical advances due to their exploitation, rather than the people who did the exploiting. And that is a first step towards changing the conversation and towards giving the real history of how we got to where we are. And then also just doctors, just having that cultural competency, knowing how to interact with people of different cultures and validating experiences, because life is very different when you feel like you're validated and when you are not being validated. You won't feel like going to a doctor who discounts all of your symptoms and say, oh, you're not really feeling that. Oh, you see that's hurting? I don't believe you. You're not going to feel comfortable. You're going to be like, okay, I'm not going to visit any doctor now. And that doesn't help anyone in the end. So I think deconstructing everything within institutions, unlearning behavior, like I said, and yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big step to approach.
It definitely is. It definitely is.
But given that, I think, it's important to have people behind every movement and behind every change, because it's ultimately society and the people within it that are going to make the changes necessary. And that kind of brings me back. You talked about this in your presentation, allies versus accomplices. And I know that there's a lot of individuals right now who would consider themselves allies because there's been like the sensationalization almost of these movements through the media, and a lot of people are just identifying with that, but they're also becoming, what you might call like part-time allies, or people that feel they're allowed to just jump in and out of movements. But like you said, for Black people, you can't jump in and out. It's your life, like. So I guess where I'm going with this is, how can people ensure that they are being accomplices and not just calling themselves allies, even when they're not, or being part-time allies? And what are like actual steps, or what can they do to make sure that they're acting as accomplices?
Yeah. So I think first of all, it's important to touch on. There's nothing wrong with being an ally per se. We definitely need more allies than racists out there. We need more anti-racist people, but we do need more people transitioning from allies to accomplices. Because I'm sure, like even on your social media feed, you probably saw a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement earlier in the year, and now it's returned to quote unquote normal, with people posting their Halloween costumes and like Iron Man suits, things like that. But man, I'm losing my train of thought. Um, but it comes down to perspective a lot of the time. Um, I think people realize that they aren't doing enough when they realize like, oh, it really, like we've said, like it is a privilege for me to not think about this every day. What can I be doing more? Can can I be helping humanity as a whole by going above and beyond and actually I'm not asking anyone to risk their personal safety or anything, but I am asking people to step out of their comfort zones and to be comfortable being uncomfortable, because there's a privilege in choosing when you're comfortable and when you're not. And marginalized people can only get so far on our own, and we need the help of the majority. Otherwise, society doesn't progress. And for most of history, the majority has been silent. So it's just changing words to action. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everything said was well said, so I really appreciate that. And I know that it's come down to time here, but I just have one last question for you, and this is kind of
Unacceptable.
all right. Well,
It's been real. No, I'm kidding.
3 questions is the limit. But I just, this is a little more interpretive for you. But you shared a little bit about your experiences, and based on those experiences, I mean, what you've been through, how you progressed through life, education, your social channels, like all these things. Like, what is something that you would like to share with our audience that you think they should know, that they should be aware of, or that they should just do?
Yeah. If I had to choose one thing, I think it'd be that the same in Black Lives Matter should never be something common. um, what's controversial? Again, I said early in the morning, but it should never be something controversial. It's not a controversial statement. It's not saying Black Lives Matter than other lives. It's just that Black lives have gone for so long being treated as if they don't matter that it's time to recognize that they do, just as much as every life, and that Black lives need to be valued because they haven't and they still aren't being valued in the way that they should. So once again, Black Lives Matter is not a controversial statement. It's just the reality. And all lives matter is a false statement until Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And that kind of makes me think like, it's almost a reminder, like more than it is anything else, because I feel like, it's saying that people forget that and they stop making change to rectify that. So absolutely well said. Well, that's everything I have for you today. I just want to say thank you so much again for being here. It means a lot to our program. It means a lot to me personally that you come and contribute your insight, your ideas, and your thoughts. And I think they're incredibly valuable.
And thank you again for inviting me. It feels good to not be forgotten, that my old program invited me back. It feels good. It warms my heart.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian.
Well, thank you for watching. That's all we have for this episode. But if you want to see more content like this, make sure to check out our YouTube channel, as well as our website, our Facebook, or our Instagram. I'll leave links for those in the description below. Now, November is coming to a close at Cal Poly, so I highly encourage you to take a look at our Men of Color Success Initiative, which I will also link down below. They're producing some great content and material. Most recently, they released their Men of Color Dialogue podcast, which is available on YouTube as well as Spotify, which I will also link down below. As always, thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you next time on the Virtual Speaker Series.